Parag, thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
I know you just arrived in Berlin. How long will you stay?
At least 4 months.
4 months.
We're
4
starting
months
to
in
think
Berlin.
longer already.
Okay, great. But you've been here, you speak German as well.
Yes.
You speak many languages. And you're involved in, let's say, the global analysis of states. You've looked into borders. I just realized that actually when you gave your TED Talk in Oxford, I was in the audience. I remember that. Looking and also listening to our first two speakers in the context of our election right now sounds as everything is more or less set. What does this tell you about Germany? How do you see this from outside?
Well, thank you, Stefan. And I first want to praise Chris and Yasha because their talks were brilliant, and it's a very nice sequencing. Almost in reverse, Yasha says this is an extraordinary time, and he's right. And Chris points out that we can actually take the challenges of today and look forward to the opportunities of the future. And in that light, what I want to say is that we should think about how we can constantly evolve our political systems. Of course, we should be proud of liberal democratic heritage, and there's nothing wrong with that. But to be more neutral, if you will, about the times that we're in, the fact is that what differentiates the past from the present and the future is the heightened degree of complexity that we face. And any regime in the world today, whether it is a liberal democracy like a Germany or the United Kingdom, or whether it is an authoritarian kind of regime such as we see in Asia and places like China, we all have to grapple with this complexity. And some countries are going to do it better than others. So what I ask myself is, what can we here, whether it's in Germany or elsewhere in neighboring countries, what can we learn about how to grapple with complexity? How can we do it better? How can we evolve? And that doesn't mean abandoning liberal democracy at all. What it means is thinking about how to strengthen the system, how to add on certain elements. So for example, social media, right, which both Chris and Yasha commented on. How can we take those technologies and incorporate it into our governance to make it more real time? How do we get the voice of the people in an organized way on an ongoing, constant basis, not just waiting every few years for an election? Now, I think in Germany, what's fascinating is, of course, the degree of stability. I see a lot of millennials here, a lot of people who fall into that demographic that Yasha was talking about, people who
Let's ask, who's a millennial by that definition? Born after 1980? Well, about half of the, oh, no more. Okay.
Who pretty much only remembers having Mutti as your Kanzlerin. Right, yeah. So now, for a lot of people, that may mean, we want change for the sake of change.
Yes.
And that's exactly the kind of almost empty, not desperate, but almost decadent populism, because there's nothing about German life that should make you feel desperate. This is not Egypt under Mubarak, right? It's more sort of this reflex, I want change for the sake of change. But let's do a little bit more mental homework here. What is it that you would want to change? What is it in, not the politics, right? A new arrangement of people, an obsession with personality. We have plenty of that already.
Right.
What I want to stand up for is policy. Is a country getting its policy right, and how does it measure it? And there is a way. It's a deep philosophical tradition, utilitarianism, right? What are you achieving the greatest good for the greatest number of citizens, of residents, and so forth? And when you see a government that is striving to create and to modify and implement policies that do that, right? Are you maintaining high standards of education and healthcare? Is your infrastructure of good quality? Is your labor force competitive? Your industries competitive? Are you advancing to new technologies? That's policy. Right? And not everyone can be an expert in policy. The average man on the street can't. Even the collective voice of the people is not going to necessarily be an expert. It could drag you in all sorts of crazy directions. But there has to be a government that has some degree of knowledge and expertise in these issues in order to reconcile the voice of the people with the demands of a complex world and to come up with real policies. And the German government, to its credit, has been doing that a lot better than others. And that's part of the reason why we are where we are, with the election being a foregone conclusion. It's not necessarily a bad thing at all. It can be quite a good thing. The alternative is, of course, waking up on November the 8th or whatever day it was in the United States and getting an outcome that you didn't expect at all, and it is no longer the one that most people seem to want.
Right. And you wrote a book about the titled Technocracy in the US, and you look into the states and governance and what states can actually learn from other states.
Right.
Like practices that you've been analyzing in Singapore a lot. You also looked into Switzerland. what are findings that maybe even a country like us can we learn from them?
Sure.
For us, and what could that be?
It's interesting. Germany is among large countries, so United States, large demographically, not just geographically, but whether you're talking about China or Brazil or India or Japan, Germany and Japan stand out as probably the two best governed, very large countries in the world, and that's if you look at large number of indices and rankings and studies, whether it's Freedom House or Index of Democracy and so forth. Germany is really quite outstanding in this regard. But there are small countries that innovate very, very well. And so I focus on two in particular that seem to be complete opposites from each other. One is Switzerland and the other is Singapore. One is a near almost ancient democracy. The other is only a 52-year-old technocratic Asian country. But they actually have a lot in common. And so some of those things include the fact that, again, having a parliamentary democratic system, a multi-party system. In Singapore, actually, one party dominates, but it is a multi-party formally from the British legacy, if you will, inherited that. So that's better than a two-party system in the United States, where you have this immediate sort of rigid bifurcation of the system. You don't have any dynamism if you don't have at least three parties, because that way you can have coalition politics and people threatening to jump around. It creates, your feet are always held to the fire in a multi-party system. But one of the most important things that I've found is the importance of the civil service. Germany has a very good civil service. What you've seen in the UK and in the US since precisely the Thatcher-Reagan era is this complete dismantling of the role of the very humble, faceless bureaucrats. In America now, they have been really looked upon with great scorn by Steve Bannon, who just exited the White House. He used to say, he's been saying, we want to dismantle the deep state. And a number of scholars said, wait a minute, you mean that group of people who actually knows how to run a country? Those million or so people who make sure that the trains run on time, who develop tax policy, who check to make sure the bridges are functioning, who administer the parks and so forth. You want to actually fire all of them and replace them with a bunch of know-nothings? Great, good luck with that. And that's what the US has actually been doing since the 1980s. It's what Great Britain has also been doing since Thatcher. And that is also a very big part of the result today, because you haven't had people who've been able to have foresight to build scenarios, who are paid to take a little bit of time, to sit aside, paid very little, by the way, which is why we should appreciate them, to forecast what's going on. So let's just take globalization and trade. In the United States, you've had this thing called trade adjustment assistance since, believe it or not, the Kennedy administration in the 1960s. Jobs are being lost as they get outsourced. How do we compensate workers? How can we retrain them? That amounts to 0.15% of America's GDP. In Denmark, it's about 3.5% of GDP. Do you have the kind of anti-globalization backlash in Denmark? No. Nor in Switzerland, nor in Singapore, nor in Korea, nor in Germany. In countries where you have all you have to do is sit and look at the numbers. Where are jobs going? Which industries are shifting because of lower wages? What do we have to do to train the next generation of students to have the right skills to compete? How do we get them aligned with industry, right? All of the things that in Germany you actually take for granted because you have been doing them for decades and doing them well. None of that has happened in America. So you can have all sorts of philosophical explanations for the rise of Trump and populism and so forth, or you can look simply at this material indicators, the stagnation of wages, for example, that Yasha mentioned as part of this picture as well. And you can say, what are we going to do about it? And not just what are we going to do about it while I'm, president or chancellor for, a year or two or three, but what are we going to do for the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? And those bureaucrats, that civil service that every country really needs if it wants to run itself well, you have to have them work on those issues. And you can see it all over the place. And Germany does, again, the coalition politics, the strong civil service. Also now getting people's views through social media is also important here. You also have these technical mechanisms. I mean, Germany, in the Grundgesetz, you're always modifying. There's new laws. There's thinking about what to do about privacy and technology. What to do about what are the official languages in the country. You have a way of reconciling between the Bundestag and the Bundesrat, Vermittlungsausschuss. You don't have things like that in the US. They're just winging it. It's so funny because in America we say oldest continuous functioning democracy, 200 plus years, in so many areas where you could have a technical fix like a Vermittlungsausschuss. You say, let's do that, and that way we won't have to stop government, right? Freeze government, shut down government in order to get a budget passed.
Yes.
You have to have all these special committees that are emergency measures to get things done. Well, you could also just fix the problem through a constitutional modification. But in the US, you haven't really meaningfully modified the Constitution in a very long time.
I mean, there are people that say that the ability to innovate large countries, like also Germany, is just super low. It's like it's super hard to do this. I remember a conversation with people that said the ministries we have today were actually created by the late 19th century, the structure. Everybody would say, today, in 2017, probably the world has changed. We're still operating on the same operating system, Ministry of Defense, we have the same structure, same employees, right? The same thing. They work in silos, like they do. They should cooperate much more. They could have a WhatsApp group, maybe.
Right.
Probably it's not allowed, right? So how do you bring innovation in there, but also how can you rethink government as a whole? I mean, how can you do that? Do you think we can do this in Germany?
I mean,
you
of
trust
course,
us?
Western liberal democracies are going to have an executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch, civil service, various ministries and agencies, and there's no need to necessarily change that. But how they work together matters. It's funny that you mentioned, though. I mean, it's in the United States you can continue to multiply the number of bureaucracies rather than consolidating them. Here, if you go to Torstrasse, actually, you'll see the Bundesministerium für Wirtschaft und Energie, right? So they used to be two separate things, right? Wirtschaft, Energie. But actually, this government in the last 5, 6 years has said, wait a minute, how can you really plan an economy without thinking about the cost and the sources of energy to fuel, whether industry, technology, various sectors? So there actually have been fused together. I wish we would actually see a lot more of that around the world, because that would actually create these conversations that you're saying, rightly so, are absolutely necessary.
Yeah, we need that. So, and we need to end, which is very sad. I think it would be great to have more time. A short answer on Europe. Like, if you look at Germany right now where we are a relevant force in Europe. Looking at this as well now from a global perspective, what does it mean for Europe? And Europe has been challenged, and many people now say that nothing, Trump was the best thing that ever happened to Europe, because for the first time people say, it's so great to be European, because actually I want to say, it's great not to be American right now. But I doubt that the identity and the emotion, for the European idea is stronger. But I think maybe there's a chance. Like, how do you see this from outside?
And just quickly, I mean, Europeans should rightly, not just because of Trump, I hope, have a lot more confidence in their political systems. Again, according to all the political science research around the quality of democracy, pretty much 19 of the 20, best rated countries in the world in terms of the quality of government are European democracies, right? So you should rather be where you are and who you are. Now, at the European level, though, in terms of global influence, of course, I believe the EU has to stick together. Fortunately, the Eurozone has. There are certain issues like austerity and immigration where if you take an analytical view, you would say, wait a minute, the austerity that's been imposed, if you will, on people has not been, certainly from a utilitarian perspective, has not generated results, right? Crushing people's, wages and forcing higher savings is not going to drive growth and consumption and economic rebound. So that mistake shouldn't have been made in the first place. When it comes to immigration, Europe is a collection of countries with largely sub-replacement fertility rates and very significant labor mismatches between what citizens and indigenous people do and what immigrants can do. So again, a technocratic approach would say, we have to have more immigrants, otherwise we will die. But let's figure out how to phase them into certain sectors and control it so it's not overwhelming. So I do believe that there are rational approaches to this, and it's not gonna work at the whole pan-European level all at once. We know that's not how Europe operates. But I really hope Germany can be a great example. It certainly is already by having the stability in the government, by being really the leader of Europe. And other countries can learn from everything that Germany is doing in terms of language integration, for example. There's great things going on here, and if Europe, following what you were saying earlier, not just countries across the world learning from each other, but just European countries, then hopefully we'll start to see the collective hold itself together better than it has been.
Well, Sounds like an exciting time. Last question, what is your focus here in the 4 months in Berlin?
It's going to be about Asia, actually, explaining Asia, if you will, to the West more broadly, but also getting European views on Asia, because in fact, a lot of us have grown up, if you're not a millennial, if you're a little bit older, in this world where the transatlantic economic and strategic relationship was the fundamental anchor of global geopolitics and economics. But actually today, the European Union trades more with Asia than it does with North America, a lot more, and you probably didn't know that. So Europe as a whole is already strategically reorienting itself towards Asia on the other end of this great Eurasian landmass. Even if you're intellectually, ideologically, linguistically, or in values, if you feel that there is this transatlantic Western community, believe it or not, there is this Eurasian community that's coming together, and it's going to be, I believe, the great geopolitical story of the 21st century.
Fantastic. We're looking forward to hear from you.
Absolutely.
We might tap into that also very soon, hopefully when you're here. Thanks for coming and sharing the time with us. And thanks to you, Parag Khanna.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.